Look up at the tallest tree you have ever laid eyes on. Maybe it was a California redwood, pushing nearly 300 feet into the air. Maybe it was a Douglas fir, or an ancient oak wider than a car is long. You stood there at its base, tilted your head back, and felt small. You felt genuinely, measurably small. Now imagine that same tree as a sapling. Imagine that the thing you were staring up at, the thing that made you feel like an insect, wasn't even a fully mature specimen. Imagine that above the canopy you were gazing into, there was another canopy. And above that, yet another. Imagine that the real forest, the original forest, made redwoods look like weeds. This isn't fantasy. This is geology. This is fossil evidence. This is the question an increasing number of researchers, historians, and independent scholars are beginning to ask. Not because they want to be controversial, but because the evidence keeps pointing toward directions the official story refuses to follow. Where did the giant trees go? Why do the oldest maps label as mountain ranges what we now call rock formations? Why does 19th-century Tartarian architecture feature ventilation systems built directly into walls, with ceilings so high a man on horseback could ride right through the front doors? Why are the people in 1800s photographs consistently smaller than the door frames, the windows, and the furniture they stand next to? And most importantly, why does the oxygen record in ancient ice cores show concentrations that would make modern humans feel like they were breathing pure electricity? Today, we're going to answer all of that. And by the time we're finished, you'll look at forests differently. You'll look at mountains differently. You'll look at a photograph from the 1880s and notice something you never noticed before. The story starts with oxygen, not the concept of it, but the specific, measurable, terrifying fact that the air we breathe today is not the air this planet was designed to produce. Ice cores drilled from Antarctica and Greenland contain trapped bubbles of ancient atmosphere. These bubbles are time capsules. Scientists can extract them and measure the precise composition of air from thousands and tens of thousands of years ago. What they consistently find is that oxygen levels in the ancient past were significantly higher than the 21% we breathe today. Some measurements from amber and fossilized tree resin, which sealed ancient air inside itself like a biological time capsule, show oxygen concentrations of 30% and above. 30% oxygen. Let that sink in for a moment. Right now, you breathe 21%. At sea level, after a full night's sleep, with no stress, in good health, 21%. Athletes train at altitude to force their bodies to adapt to less. Hospitals pump extra oxygen into patients who can't survive on ambient air. We treat 21% as the baseline, as normal, as the God-given atmospheric composition of Earth. But the planet's own record says otherwise. At 30% oxygen, combustion happens faster. Fire spreads with a violence that modern fire models can't replicate. Insects grow larger, because they breathe through their bodies, through spiracles and tracheae, and the size they can reach is directly limited by how much oxygen can diffuse through tissue. At 30%, that limit expands dramatically. Dragonflies with 2.5-foot wingspans. Millipedes 8 feet long. Scorpions the size of dogs. The fossil record is full of them, and paleontologists explain them as products of ancient high-oxygen atmospheres without fully examining what produced that oxygen, or what happened to it. The answer to what produced it is the one mainstream science doesn't want to say out loud. Trees. Not the trees we have now. Not the forests we're fighting to preserve in the Amazon. Not the managed timber operations in Scandinavia. Not the suburban tree canopy in your neighborhood. Something else. Something that makes our tallest trees look like ground cover. The Carboniferous period, roughly 350 to 300 million years ago, is named for the carbon it deposited. The coal we burn today, every seam, deposit, and underground layer of fossil carbon on this planet, is the compressed, fossilized remains of that era's forests. Geologists know this. It's not disputed. What produced the coal was biological material on a scale genuinely difficult to comprehend. Lycopods, club mosses, fern relatives. In the Carboniferous, these grew to heights of 100 to 160 feet. Sigillaria trees, with trunks 3 to 6 feet in diameter, growing in dense stands. Lepidodendron trees reaching 150 feet, their bark covered in diamond-shaped leaf scars that still appear in coal mines today. These weren't small plants that happened to get compacted over millions of years. These were forests of such massive biological production that when they died and fell, the fungi and bacteria that would normally decompose them didn't yet exist. The lignin in their wood was a new biochemical compound. Nothing on Earth had evolved to break it down. So the trees fell. And instead of rotting back into the atmosphere, they accumulated layer after layer after layer, compressed under geological weight, becoming coal. The oxygen they produced during their lives went into the atmosphere and stayed there. That's where the 30% came from. That's the record in the amber. That's the record in the ice. Now hold that thought. Hold the image of those forests, those enormous, photosynthetically hyperactive forests producing oxygen at a rate we can't match today. Now hold the image of the creatures that lived under that canopy, scaled appropriately to the air and resources available. Then ask the question, what killed the giant trees? The mainstream answer is geological time, slow change, continental drift, climate shifts, evolutionary replacement. The Carboniferous forest gave way to other ecosystems over hundreds of millions of years. That's the story. But here's where it gets complicated. Here's where the Tartarian question enters the room. Because there's a separate body of evidence, much more recent, much harder to dismiss geologically, suggesting that the giant trees didn't disappear 300 million years ago. That they were still here. That the silicon dioxide formations we call mesas, buttes, and rock columns in the American Southwest, the formations in Cappadocia, the Sahara, across Siberia, aren't made of rock at all. That they are the fossilized, silicate remains of trees so large that when they fell and turned to stone, we looked at them and thought they were mountains. This is the theory of the petrified giant trees. And it isn't fringe internet speculation. It begins with a straightforward geological observation. Silicon dioxide is the primary mineral compound in wood after its silicates. When wood petrifies, mineral-rich water permeates the cellular structure and replaces organic material with stone, crystal by crystal, preserving the shape. We have petrified logs. Petrified stumps. We have the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, where ancient logs 200 million years old lie scattered across the desert, their original cellular structure visible under a microscope, their grain and rings still readable. Those logs are 150 to 200 feet long. Triassic trees. Already beyond anything alive today. Now look at the mesas of the Colorado Plateau. Look at the flat tops. Look at the vertical sides. Look at the internal layering that, when examined closely, doesn't match the random stratification of sedimentary deposition, but instead shows the concentric ring structures of biological growth. Look at the photographs taken during the early exploration of the American West, the daguerreotypes and wet plates from the 1860s and 1870s, showing geological formations that the explorers themselves described with a vocabulary of awe beyond anything they used for ordinary rock. Look at the specific shape of a tree stump. Flat top. Vertical sides flaring slightly at the base. Internal structure radiating outward from a central core. Now look at Devil's Tower in Wyoming. Devil's Tower is 867 feet tall. Officially, it's made of igneous rock, a volcanic intrusion that cooled and fractured into columns. The columns are hexagonal. Regular. They extend from the base to the flat top with a geometric precision that geology produces under specific conditions, and that biology also produces under specific conditions. The debate over whether Devil's Tower is a geological formation or the remains of a biological one isn't resolved by simply pointing and saying it looks like a tree stump. But those arguing for the biological explanation aren't wrong to notice what they notice. The geometry is real. The flat top is real. The radial column structure is real. And the questions it raises are legitimate scientific questions, not conspiracy theories. Because here's the thing about conspiracy theories, they require a conspirator, a deliberate plan, a group of people deciding together to deceive. What the Tartarian evidence suggests isn't a conspiracy. It suggests an event, a catastrophe so total, so complete, that it didn't require anyone to cover it up, because the survivors didn't know what had been lost. The knowledge wasn't hidden. It was simply gone. Let's talk about Tartaria. The name appears on European maps from the 13th through the 18th century, covering a territory stretching from Eastern Europe across Central Asia to the Pacific coast. Tartaria, Tartary, the great empire of the Tartars. On some maps, it's divided into Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary. On some maps, it dwarfs every other nation on Earth. On some maps, it's simply labeled Magna Tartaria, Great Tartary. And then, in the 19th century, it disappears. Not through conquest. Not through documented military defeat. Not through treaties or revolutions that leave paper trails. It simply stops appearing on maps. The territory gets absorbed into Russia, into China, into nations we recognize today, with no official explanation for what Tartaria was, who ran it, or why it was so thoroughly erased that most people today have never even heard the name. The mainstream explanation is that Tartaria was never a unified empire, just a geographic designation, a European cartographic convention for the vast, poorly documented lands east of the Urals. That the Tatars were a collection of nomadic peoples, not a civilization, and the label was a colonial approximation of incomprehensible complexity. That when Russia expanded eastward and the territory became documented, the label became redundant and disappeared. This explanation has merit. It's not unreasonable. But it doesn't account for the buildings. All over the world, many in cities supposedly founded in the 18th and 19th centuries, there are buildings that don't match their official construction histories. Buildings with foundations far deeper than surface structures require. Buildings with basement levels classified as subterranean even though they were clearly designed as ground floor spaces, with windows at street level now below the street, with door heights calibrated for occupants significantly taller than modern or 19th century humans. The World's Fairs of the late 19th century are the most concentrated example. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the 1889 Paris Exposition, the 1900 Paris Exposition, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. These events produced enormous architectural complexes, entire cities of neoclassical buildings constructed in timelines professional architects today say are impossible. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 covered 690 acres. It included 200 buildings, many of them enormous, constructed over 2 years. Official accounts describe armies of workers, day and night shifts, industrial production scaled to a degree never seen before. The buildings were called the White City. They were demolished after the fair, almost all of them. Structures that took 2 years to build were torn down within months. This is the pattern Tartarian researchers repeatedly point to: grand structures built at impossible speed, then destroyed. Not repurposed, not converted, destroyed. Why would you demolish a 60,000 square foot neoclassical building that took 2 years to build? The official answer: they were temporary, plaster over steel frames, not meant to last. The fair was an exhibition, not a city. When it ended, the exhibition ended. But photographs of the interior show pipe organs installed in the walls, mosaic floors, vaulted ceilings with frescoes, heating systems integrated into the structure. These aren't features of temporary exhibition buildings. These are features of permanent infrastructure, built by a civilization that intended to stay. And then there's the mud flood. The mud flood theory is the cornerstone of the Tartarian reconstruction. It holds that at some point in the recent past, centuries ago, or possibly more recently, a catastrophic event deposited a layer of mud across enormous swaths of the northern hemisphere. The evidence is in the buildings. Specifically, buildings where the ground floor is now the basement. Where windows designed at ground level are now underground. Where door handles sit at knee height because the door itself was installed when the ground was 2 or 3 feet lower. Walk through the older neighborhoods of any major European city, or the older parts of San Francisco, or the older districts of St. Louis, and you'll find them. Buildings where the ground floor has been converted to a basement. Buildings where small windows near what's now street level look in at ceiling height. Buildings where the stairs down to the current basement door are clearly original architecture, not a later excavation. The standard explanation is subsidence, gradual settling of buildings into soft ground, or deliberate raising of street levels for drainage. Both happen. Both are real. But subsidence doesn't raise the street, it lowers the building. And deliberate street raising leaves a record. Chicago famously raised its street level in the 1850s and 1860s, with detailed accounts and photographs. Other cities have no such records. The ground level simply appears to have changed without documentation. The mud flood theory holds that a cataclysm, possibly a comet impact, a solar event, or a geomagnetic reversal causing massive flooding, deposited material across the landscape. Survivors, emerging from whatever sheltered them, found a world partially buried. They dug out what they could. What they couldn't dig out, they adapted. Basement windows became ventilation. Subterranean ground floors became storage. Street level reset at whatever height the mud had settled to, and that became the new normal. This isn't impossible. It isn't even improbable. Flood layers appear in the geological record regularly. The biblical flood narrative appears in cultures with no contact with each other, suggesting a real event significant enough to be encoded in myth. The Younger Dryas impact event, 12,900 years ago, left a layer of shocked minerals and iridium across North America and Europe, consistent with a large extraterrestrial impact or air burst. What would an event like that do to the atmosphere? Here's where oxygen returns. A catastrophic impact or air burst would produce enormous quantities of particulate matter, soot, ash, mineral dust, aerosols. These would block sunlight. Sunlight blocked means photosynthesis reduced. Photosynthesis reduced means oxygen production reduced. The surviving forest, already stressed by whatever physical damage the initial event caused, would be producing less oxygen into a more polluted atmosphere. And if the theory of the giant trees is correct, if the original tree cover of this planet wasn't the forest we have now, but something vastly larger and more productive, then the destruction of that tree cover would have been catastrophic for atmospheric oxygen in a way that losing a normal forest simply wouldn't be. Losing the Amazon reduces oxygen. Losing a forest of 1,000-foot trees with canopies covering continents changes the atmosphere permanently. The organisms that survived would need to adapt. Smaller body size means less oxygen demand. Over generations, species would get smaller, not through Darwinian evolution across millions of years, but through the kind of rapid phenotypic compression that starvation and atmospheric stress can produce within decades. Look at the fossil record for the transition period. Look at the megafauna extinctions. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, cave bears, short-faced bears, dire wolves, giant beavers the size of bears, glyptodonts, terror birds. The vast majority of these go extinct in a geological eye blink, clustered around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, roughly corresponding to the end of the last ice age and the Younger Dryas event. The standard explanation is climate change and human hunting pressure. Humans spreading across new continents hunted naive megafauna to extinction. Warming climates destroyed habitat. These factors combined to produce the mass extinction. This explanation has been challenged repeatedly. Many of these species had survived previous interglacial warming periods of comparable magnitude. The hunting hypothesis requires population densities and technological capabilities that don't match the archaeological record for early postglacial humans. The alternative hypothesis, that an atmospheric event produced rapid oxygen reduction, overwhelming species adapted to high oxygen environments, fits the timeline, the geography, and the pattern of which species survived. Smaller animals with lower metabolic demand survived better. Humans, highly adaptable generalists, survived. And so here we are. Smaller than we were. Breathing less oxygen than the planet was built to provide. Living in cities built on top of older cities, with buildings whose windows now sit below the street. The question of Tartaria isn't really about Tartaria. It isn't really about an empire, or a map label, or a geopolitical history that's been erased. The question of Tartaria is about continuity, about whether the civilization we inherited is really the civilization that was here, or whether we are the inheritors of a recovery, a reconstruction, an attempt to rebuild after a catastrophe so complete that the people doing the rebuilding didn't fully know what they were rebuilding from. The architecture suggests the latter. The buildings that appeared in the early 19th century, the grand neoclassical structures in St. Petersburg, Chicago, San Francisco, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, all sharing design languages that would require centuries of shared architectural tradition to produce spontaneously in multiple locations simultaneously, suggests that someone was working from memory, from a template, from a civilization that had existed before the one they were living in. The technology embedded in those buildings confirms it. The heating systems, ventilation, acoustic design of the great halls, water management, these aren't the technologies of a civilization in its early industrial period, discovering these solutions for the first time. These are technologies of a civilization deploying solutions it already understood, installing them into new structures as a matter of standard practice. Who taught the builders of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair how to install a pipe organ into a temporary exhibition building? Who taught them to design the acoustic properties of a hall they planned to demolish in 2 years? Knowledge without origin. Practice without explicit history. The signature of a civilization reconstructing itself from fragments of a memory it cannot fully access. The trees are the key. Because if the giant trees existed, and the geological and fossil evidence gives strong reason to believe something much larger than what we have now once covered this planet, and if those trees were cut down or destroyed by an event within recoverable history rather than geological deep time, then the oxygen reduction they caused would have produced exactly the biological compression we see in the fossil and biological record. Smaller humans. Shorter lifespans. Reduced cognitive and physical capacity compared to what the fossil record suggests our ancestors possessed. The bones found in older layers. Skulls with cranial volumes larger than modern averages. Femurs suggesting statures we associate with mythology. Giants. The heroes of the ancient world. Not myths about supernatural beings, but memories of normal humans living in a normal atmosphere with 30% oxygen, fed by megafauna that no longer exist, in an energy environment the pre-catastrophe Earth provided, and that Tartarian architecture was apparently designed to harness. The cover story is the one we call history. Consider what we actually know about the pre-1800 world versus what we're told. The primary sources for ancient history are almost entirely textual, produced by a tiny literate class, translated and curated by subsequent generations with their own agendas. The physical evidence is profoundly incomplete, governed by what has been excavated, what has been classified, and by academic orthodoxies that actively resist heterodox interpretation even when physical evidence demands it. The standard history of 1000 CE to 1800 CE gives us a world of subsistence agriculture, feudal lords, and grinding poverty for the vast majority of human beings. A world in which architectural achievements of the scale we see in surviving buildings are simply assumed without being explained, because explaining them would require invoking labor forces and engineering knowledge that the historical model of that period cannot accommodate. How did medieval Europe build the cathedrals? The engineering knowledge embedded in those structures, acoustic design, load distribution, window-to-wall ratios optimized for both lighting and structural integrity, didn't come from nowhere. It came from a tradition. From a lineage of knowledge the builders were applying, not discovering. The same is true for the Islamic, Persian, Mughal, and Chinese architecture of the same period. All of these traditions, separated by vast distances in an era of supposedly very limited communication, demonstrate shared structural principles suggesting not parallel independent development, but descent from a common source. A common source that was Tartaria, or predates Tartaria, or is simply the civilization that existed before the catastrophe the mud flood researchers say buried the evidence. We are not the first civilization on this planet. We are probably not the second. We are the current attempt, built on foundations we do not understand, breathing air degraded from what it once was, smaller and shorter-lived than the beings who came before us, living in cities that are palimpsests, layers of occupation written over each other so many times that recovering what was originally written requires looking at what was preserved and asking why. Of all the things that could have survived, exactly these things did. The giant trees were the foundation. They produced the atmosphere. The atmosphere produced the biology. The biology produced the civilization. When the trees were cut down, or burned, or silicified into the formations we now mistake for mountains, the cascade began. Oxygen dropped. Creatures got smaller. Lifespans shortened. The technology to replace what the living forest had provided had to be invented, or remembered, or cobbled together from whatever fragments of original knowledge survived. What we call the Industrial Revolution is, on this reading, not a revolution at all. It's a partial recovery. Humans rediscovering coal, the compressed remains of the original forest, and burning it to produce the energy the forest once provided for free. Releasing back into the atmosphere the carbon the original trees had fixed, hoping new plant growth would eventually begin the long recovery of atmospheric oxygen. We are not at the beginning of a story. We are somewhere in the middle of a very long one, and the chapters that explain how we got here have been lost, or buried, or transformed into myth and dismissed. The rocks we drive past on the highway. The flat-top mesas on the horizon. The stone columns in national parks. The silicified formations rising from desert floors. What if they are not rocks? What if they are what's left of the world before the world we know? What if the stumps are still there, turned to stone, waiting for someone to look at them and say, something grew here. Something enormous grew here. And when it was gone, everything changed. Oxygen dropped. Everything alive got smaller. And the civilization that remembered what it was like before is the one we call Tartaria, the one that doesn't appear on any map after 1800, the one whose buildings we are still living in, whose foundations go deeper than our streets, whose towers we removed and forgot we removed, whose archive burned in fires that swept through cities with suspicious speed, and whose name, when you say it to most people today, produces a blank look that is itself a kind of data. That blank look is the evidence. You don't forget the name of the largest empire on Earth by accident.